The world of the Middle Ages was not ruled by kings or knights as much as it was by the seasons. Winter, long, merciless, and unrelenting, was a true monarch of medieval life. When the first frost touched the fields, survival became uncertain. Crops failed, granaries emptied, and neighbors vanished under blankets of snow. In an age without central heating, modern medicine, or reliable food supply, every winter was a gamble between endurance and death. This is a forgotten story of how ordinary people struggled, suffered, and sometimes triumphed against the coldest enemy of all, nature itself. The story of medieval Europe is, in many ways, a story of survival. Kings and nobles may have held crowns, and churches may have claimed divine authority, but none of these powers could control the force that most determined life and death, the seasons. Above all, it was winter that tested human endurance. Long, cold months where harvests vanished, hunger-stalked villages, and survival depended not on wealth alone but on preparation, resilience, and luck. From the late Middle Ages onward, climate itself turned harsher. Historians and climatologists call it the Little Ice Age, a period stretching roughly from the 14th to the 19th centuries. In these centuries, Europe experienced colder temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and more erratic weather patterns. Its beginnings coincided with some of the most devastating crises of medieval life. Although winters had always been difficult, the Little Ice Age brought a new intensity to the struggle. Rivers that once flowed freely froze solid. Seas turned dangerous with ice and storms. Villages endured snowfalls that buried crops and cut off travel. For communities already living close to subsistence, even small changes in climate could mean catastrophe. The medieval world lacked the technologies that today buffer us from seasonal extremes. There was no central heating, no mechanized transport, no global trade routes that could reliably deliver food across continents in times of shortage. A poor harvest in one region might mean starvation for thousands. Unlike the wealthy elites of later centuries, most medieval people were bound to the rhythm of local agriculture. They planted in spring, tended fields in summer, harvested in autumn, and prayed that their stores would last until the next cycle began. Winter was a void between harvests, and for many, it was the most dangerous season of all. Settlement patterns were deeply shaped by this reality. Villages clustered around arable land, rivers, and forests. Proximity to fields meant easier access to grain. Rivers provided water, fish, and limited trade. Forests offered firewood, berries, and game. The placement of communities was not random but dictated by survival needs. Winters too harsh or too long could devastate entire regions, forcing migration or abandonment. Archaeological studies reveal deserted villages across Europe. Their decline often linked to cycles of famine and freezing winters. People sought not only fertile soil but also landscapes where survival through the coldest months were possible. Daily life revolved around the expectation of seasonal hardship. Every summer was a race against time to prepare. Grain had to be threshed and stored, root vegetables buried in pits, livestock slaughtered or sheltered. Firewood was gathered in massive quantities, yet shortages were constant. Families slept together in shared rooms to preserve body heat. In towns, even nobles in stone castles suffered from draughts, smoky fires, and bitter cold that crept into great halls. While the wealthy had more food and servants to ease their winters, no one was immune from the raw force of climate. The danger was compounded by the narrow margin between plenty and disaster. A single poor harvest could exhaust reserves. Repeated failures led to famine, and famine quickly spiraled into disease. Malnutrition weakened bodies, opening the door to epidemics of influenza, dysentery, or plague. Winter was therefore not just a time of hunger, but a season when death rates surged. Parish records and chronicles frequently noted spikes in mortality between January and March, when supplies ran low and illnesses spread. For ordinary people, winter was expected, yet always feared. It was an annual reckoning that shaped culture, religion, and even psychology. Festivals like Christmas, Candlemas, and Twelfth Night offered not only spiritual meaning but communal relief, moments of warmth and shared celebration in the depths of the cold. Yet these were fragile interruptions in a season otherwise defined by risk. Folklore brimmed with stories of spirits, demons, and punishments that embodied the fear of starvation or exposure. Survival was never taken for granted. Even rulers and institutions recognized the power of the seasons. Kings might levy taxes, wage wars, or decree laws, but their authority collapsed if the harvest failed. Chroniclers recorded famines with the same gravity of battles, noting years when bread failed and men ate roots and grass. The church, too, tied its calendar to agricultural cycles, reinforcing rhythms of fasting, feasting, and prayer. Fate became a way to understand the season's unpredictability. Harsh winters seen as divine punishment, mild ones as signs of mercy. The broader patterns of the Little Ice Age intensified this sense of dependence. Between the 14th and 19th centuries, evidence shows glacier advancing, growing seasons shortening, and winters deepening. The River Thames in London froze solid multiple times between the 15th and 19th centuries, allowing frost phase to be held on the ice. While picturesque in later memory, these freezes were symptoms of a harsher climate that brought misery to rural populations. Northern Europe was especially vulnerable, but no region was untouched. Scandinavian settlements in Greenland, established during earlier, milder centuries, collapsed in part because colder winters cut them off from resources and trade. Climate was not just background, it was a force that ended communities and reshaped human history. By the High Middle Ages, people had developed strategies to cope, but these remained fragile. Crop rotation and the introduction of hardier grains like rye and oats helped buffer against poor harvests, but they could not prevent disaster when winters extended into spring. In some years, planting was delayed so long that harvests never matured before the frost returned. Entire generations remembered such years as turning points in their lives, marking childhood scarred by hunger or families broken by migration. The medieval calendar reflected the expectation of winter suffering. The so-called hungry gap, the late winter period before new crops could be planted and harvested, was dreaded above all. It was a recurring season of scarcity, baked into the rhythm of life. Unlike modern societies, where spring suggests renewal, in the medieval world, spring often meant the highest risk of starvation. By then, stored grain was exhausted, livestock weakened, and communities endured the most deaths. This cycle of dread and endurance defined the mentality of entire societies. The paradox of winter was that it was both ordinary and extraordinary. It came every year, shaping habits and traditions, yet each instance carried uncertainty. Would the stores last? Would disease spread? Would neighbors survive? This constant threat cultivated a culture of resilience but also fatalism. People expected loss as much as survival. Death was not an aberration but a part of the seasonal rhythm. In this way, the climate shaped not only settlement and economy but worldviews, embedding hardship into the medieval understanding of life itself. When we look back on medieval Europe, we often imagine the dominance of lords, the splendor of cathedrals, or the violence of wars. Yet beneath these narratives lies a quieter, more universal story, the negotiation with nature. The medieval world was not simply a landscape of power struggles, but a delicate balance between human effort and seasonal force. Winter was a great equalizer. No throne, no title, no estate could fully protect against its grip. The opening of the Little Ice Age made this balance more precarious. Europe entered a period where winters grew longer, colder, and deadlier. Communities that had once endured found themselves facing new extremes. Chronicles of the 14th century begin to fill with accounts of failed harvests, frozen rivers, and desperate migrations. Winter was no longer just a background of life. It was a crisis that reshaped economies, societies, and even the fate of nations. This was a world at the mercy of the seasons, a world where survival depended less on crowns or armies and on barns filled with grain, with stacked for fire, and the resilience of ordinary people facing nature's coldest test. The medieval year was built around a single defining event, the harvest. In an age before industrial farming, global supply chains, or refrigeration, survival depended on the success or failure of those few weeks in late summer and early autumn. Every household, from peasant cottages to noble estates, measured time by the gathering of crops. A bountiful harvest promised relief from hunger and warmth through the bitter months ahead. A poor one could mean despair, famine, and death. Preparation for winter began long before the first snow. It was a process of months, layered with ritual, hard labor, and communal effort. For peasants, the stakes could not have been higher. Their survival depended almost entirely on the land they tilled and the stores they managed to protect. Medieval agriculture was labor-intensive and vulnerable. Grain crops like wheat, barley, rye, and oats were the foundation of sustenance. Alongside them grew peas, beans, and root vegetables, supplemented by dairy, eggs, and meat when available. But in most communities, bread was life. Without sufficient grain, the winter became a season of hunger. The urgency of harvest was palpable. Families worked from dawn to dusk in the fields. Men cut stalks with sickles, women gathered and bound sheaves, and children gleaned leftover stalks from the soil. In some villages, the entire community labored together, each household contributing to ensure collective survival. This was not only necessity but tradition, a reminder that winter could not be faced alone. Shared barns, communal ovens, and collective threshing bound people into networks of dependence and obligation. To neglect the harvest was to gamble with the lives of one's neighbors. Once cut, the grain required careful processing. Threshing separated kernels from husks, and winnowing removed chaff. These steps were time-consuming but vital, for improperly prepared grain spoiled quickly. Storage became the next challenge. Grain was piled in barns or sealed in pits lined with straw and clay to keep out moisture and rodents. Despite precautions, vermin often invaded, contaminating supplies and spreading disease. The loss of even a portion of stored grain could tip a family into hunger before winter's end. Preservation extended beyond grains. Livestock had to be managed carefully, since animal consumed fodder that was in short supply. Many families slaughtered a portion of their herds in late autumn, salting or smoking the meat to last through the cold months. Pigs, sheep, and cattle that survived the cold had to be sheltered and fed, often competing with humans for scarce stores of oats or hay. Fish was salted or dried. Dairy was turned into butter and hard cheese that could keep longer. Nothing was wasted, for waste in autumn meant hunger in March. For wealthier households, preparation took a different shape. Nobles had larger granaries, more livestock, and servants to manage their estates. They could stockpile luxuries like imported spices, wine, or preserved fruits. Yet even castles faced limits. Vast halls demanded immense quantities of firewood, which had to be gathered and stored in advance. Noble kitchens, though better stocked, also relied on the same fragile agricultural cycles. A failed harvest in the surrounding lands could bring scarcity even to the high table. The nobility's survival depended not just on wealth, but on the productivity of peasants bound to their estates. The harvest season also carried spiritual significance. Churches blessed fields, crops, and labors, intertwining faith with survival. Rituals of thanksgiving accompanied successful harvests, while prayers and processions marked years of poor yield. The connection between divine favor and agricultural success was deeply ingrained. A good harvest was proof of God's mercy, a bad one, a reminder of sin and punishment. Festivals like Lammas, held in August, celebrated the first loaves baked from the new grain, symbolizing both gratitude and hope for the months ahead. Yet despite the rituals and precautions, uncertainty loomed. Weather was a decisive factor, and it was beyond human control. A late frost could ruin budding plants. Excessive rain could rot grain in the fields. Drought left soil cracked and barren. Chroniclers across medieval Europe repeatedly described years when nature seemed to conspire against survival. The harvest of 1315, for example, was devastated by relentless rains, setting off the great famine that lasted until 1317. In that catastrophe, millions perished, not from war or plague, but from the absence of food. Such events haunted the memory of generations, a stark reminder that no amount of preparation guaranteed safety. The preparation for winter was not only physical but psychological. Families lived with the knowledge that their survival depended on the balance of a few stores of grain, the careful rationing of salted meat, and the hope that the season would not stretch too long. Hunger was a familiar companion, and the threat of starvation shaped attitudes toward generosity, hoarding, and theft. Laws were enacted to punish those who stole grain from barns, while villages imposed strict customs on gleaning and gathering. The fear of winter bred discipline, but also suspicion, as neighbors watched one another's stores with anxious eyes. The communal nature of harvest also reinforced social hierarchies. Lords collected tithes, clergy claimed their share, and taxes were extracted from peasant produce. The very act of gathering food for survival became entangled with systems of power. A family that managed to store enough grain might still see it taken as dues, leaving them vulnerable while others feasted. Winter scarcity was not shared equally. It fell hardest on the poor. Even with abundance, there were dangers. Stored grain, if damp, could develop ergot, a fungus that produced toxins. Consuming tainted bread led to convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death, a phenomenon later called St. Anthony's fire. Such outbreaks were particularly common in years of shortage, when families consumed whatever bread they could make, regardless of quality. Thus, even the food that promised survival could turn into a hidden enemy. By November, the season of preparation gave way to waiting. Fields lay bare, orchards empty, and barns full wanting, depending on fortune. The final culling of animals, the salting of meat, and the sealing of grain pits marked the threshold into winter. Families withdrew into their homes, fires lit, doors barred against snow and cold. Their fates were sealed by the work of the harvest months. The cycle repeated year after year, a rhythm so familiar that it defined identity and culture. Medieval life was bound to this cadence of labor and waiting, of hope and fear. Winter was not a surprise but an inevitability, and the harvest was the only shield against its power. Whether in a peasant's hut or a noble's hall, the question was the same. Had they gathered enough to see the spring? For those who had, winter meant endurance. For those who had not, it meant hunger, disease, and the possibility of death. In this way, the harvest was not merely agricultural labor. It was a pivot on which medieval existence turned. Autumn fields determined whether villages lived or died, whether children thrived or wasted, whether kingdoms prospered or fell into famine. The harvest was survival, and survival was everything. When the last sheaves of grain had been gathered and the first frost began to bite, the medieval household turned inward. Survival through the cold months depended not only on the food in storage, but on the strength of the home itself. In a world without central heating, insulation, or electricity, the medieval house became the front line against winter. Its walls, roofs, and fires were not conveniences. They were shields against the season's relentless assault. Peasant homes, the majority of dwellings across Europe, were simple structures built from whatever materials lay close at hand. In England, wattle and dog walls, woven wooden frames packed with mud and straw, were common. In northern regions, logs and rough stone provided sturdier protection. Roofs were often thatched, layered with straw or reeds that insulated well but carried constant risk of fire. Floors were typically bare earth, sometimes strewn with rushes to absorb moisture and waste. Windows, if present at all, were small openings covered with oilcloth, with shutters, or, in wealthier homes, panes of horn. Light was dim, drafts were constant, and dampness permeated everything. Heating came almost exclusively from fire. In peasant huts, a hearth stood at the center of the single main room, its smoke rising through a hole in the roof or seeping through gaps in thatch. The smoke blackened beams and filled lungs, but it also helped preserve the thatch from rot and pests. Fire provided heat for cooking, warmth for bodies, and a fragile defense against freezing nights. Fuel was precious. Families gathered firewood in autumn, but shortages were frequent, especially in heavily populated regions where forests had been cleared. Dung and peat were burned in some areas, producing less heat and more smoke but extending supplies. Space was shared closely. A peasant family might sleep together in one room, sometimes in a single bed to preserve warmth. Straw mattresses and wool blankets offered some comfort, but the cold seeped in regardless. Livestock, vital for survival, were often kept inside or in adjoining structures to protect them from the cold, and to share their body heat with the family. Chickens roosted in corners, pigs snuffled near the hearth, and cows might be tied under the same roof. The mingling of human and animal life was unsanitary by modern standards, but it meant survival in the heart of winter. Noble households lived differently, though not always more comfortably. Castles and manor houses provided thicker walls of stone, which protected against wind but also trapped dampness and cold. Vast great halls were impressive but nearly impossible to heat. Fires roared in enormous hearths, yet the warmth reached only those who sat directly beside them. Nobles wrapped themselves in furs and heavy wool, their servants constantly stoking flames to keep even a fraction of the chill at bay. In private chambers, smaller fireplaces improved comfort, but draughts and icy floors were never fully banished. Despite their wealth, nobles faced their own version of winter discomfort. Large households required enormous supplies of firewood, coal, or peat. Servants labored constantly to hold fuel, maintain fires, and repair the structures strained by cold. Tapestries hung on walls not only for decoration, but to insulate against drafts. Straw and rushes were laid on floors to absorb moisture and provide some warmth underfoot. Wealth could ease the burden of winter, but it could not eliminate it. The contrast between peasant and noble homes was stark, yet in both cases, the household was a place of refuge and vulnerability. In the countryside, entire villages relied on the durability of their homes. Roofs collapsing under heavy snow, walls eroded by damp left families exposed. Fire posed another constant threat. A single spark could set a thatched roof ablaze, consuming a house in minutes. Winter intensified these dangers, for flames burned constantly, and repair was nearly impossible in deep snow. Food preparation defined much of life inside during winter months. The hearth was both stove and heater, its flames used to bake bread, boil pottage, and roast preserved meats. Smoke filled the room, coating rafters with soot but helping to preserve hams, and fish hung overhead. Meals were simple, stews of grains and legumes, thickened with root vegetables or scraps of salted meat. Bread was ever present, sometimes coarse and dark, sometimes fine in wealthier homes. Ale, brewed from grain, provided hydration when water supplies were frozen or unsafe. Daily rhythms adjusted to the darkness. In northern Europe, daylight in winter could last less than 8 hours. Candles and rushlights provided some illumination, but they were costly in terms of wax or tallow. Families spent long evenings in semi-darkness, telling stories, mending tools, and conserving energy. Work continued indoors, spinning wool, weaving cloth, carving wood, or repairing equipment. These tasks were essential to prepare for spring, but they also offered psychological relief against the monotony of confinement. Communal living created both solidarity and strain. Families endured hardship together, but overcrowding, smoke, and constant proximity also bred conflict. Illness spread easily in these enclosed, damp spaces. Coughs and fevers were common, often worsening in late winter when malnutrition weakened bodies. Children and the elderly suffered most. In years of scarcity, choices about food distribution within the household carried life or death weight. Survival required cooperation, but it also revealed the fragility of social bonds under stress. Architecture slowly adapted to meet these challenges. By the later Middle Ages, more homes included chimneys, allowing smoke to vent more efficiently and improving air quality. Stone floors replaced earth in some regions, and timber frame provided greater stability. In towns, multi-story houses rose, with shops on the ground floor and living quarters above. Urban homes offered more protection but faced their own dangers, fires spreading quickly between closely packed buildings and limited access to fuel in years of shortage. Despite these adaptations, the medieval home remained fundamentally vulnerable. Its purpose was not comfort but survival. Winters were endured rather than enjoyed. Yet within these modest structures, resilience took shape. Families gathered around meager fires, shared scarce food, and carried traditions that helped them face the cold. Songs, prayers, and rituals provided meaning in months when hardship was inevitable. The home became not just a physical shelter but a cultural anchor, binding communities through shared experience. Even among the nobility, grandeur could not conceal the struggle. Visitors to castles often remark on the chill of great halls, the dampness of stone walls, and the need for layers of clothing indoors. Yet castles also symbolize permanence and order in a world where nature threatened chaos. Their size, resources, and defenses offered security, even if not warmth. Lords demonstrated their power by feasting through winter, projecting stability despite the scarcity outside their gates. The medieval home, whether hut or castle, reveals a stark truth of winter life. Survival hinged on fragile defenses. Walls of mud and wood, fires of peat and straw, beds of rushes and wool. These were the boundaries between life and death. The resilience of households and the ingenuity of those who built and sustained them made survival possible in an age where nature's cold hand dictated fate. When winter settled over medieval Europe, it did not treat all people equally. For peasants, the overwhelming majority of the population, it brought an unrelenting burden of survival. Their lives were already precarious, defined by toil, obligation, and scarcity. But the cold season pressed hardest on their bodies and their resources. Winter was not merely a natural cycle. It was a test of endurance that shaped peasant life at its core. Daily struggles began with the most basic of tasks, keeping warm. In cottages of wattle and daub, with thatched roofs and earth floors, insulation was minimal. A central hearth provided some heat, but smoke filled the single room, stinging eyes and lungs. Families crowded together under blankets of wool layers of straw, conserving body heat. Firewood, gathered in autumn, dwindled quickly. In areas where forests had been cleared, peasants resorted to burning peat, dried dung, or brushwood. The smell was pungent, the heat faint, but it kept frost from claiming the home. Children and the elderly suffered most, often succumbing to exposure or illness during the coldest months. Fuel was not the only demand. Winter required constant labor, even when fields lay dormant. Animals needed tending. Cows, pigs, and chickens provided milk, eggs, and occasional meat, but they too had to be kept alive through months without pasture. Fodder had to be rationed carefully. Too little, and animals starved. Too much, and supplies ran out before spring. Many households slaughtered excess animals in late autumn, salting or smoking the meat to last. The animals that remained were sheltered inside homes or nearby barns, their body heat shared with the family. The line between survival and waste was thin, and mistakes carried heavy costs. Food was central to the struggle. Bread, the foundation of a medieval diet, depended on grain harvested and stored in autumn. For peasants, this bread was often coarse, made of rye, barley, or oats rather than wheat. It was dense, filling, and sometimes bitter, but it sustained life. Alongside bread came pottage, a stew of grains, legumes, and whatever vegetables or scraps were available. Salted pork, smoked fish, and preserved cheese supplemented meals when supplies allowed. But rations grew smaller as winter dragged on. By February or March, many households entered the hungry gap, when granaries emptied and new crops were not yet ready. Malnutrition became widespread, leaving bodies frail and more vulnerable to disease. The peasant's burden was not borne alone. It was bound up in obligations to lords and the church. Even in winter, rent and tithes had to be paid, often in grain or livestock. A family that struggled to feed itself still owed its dues, enforced by manorial courts or ecclesiastical authority. Failure to pay could mean fines, loss of land, or harsher punishments. Survival, therefore, was not simply a matter of nature but of social order. Scarcity pressed downward, with the poorest bearing the greatest risk. Work in winter shifted from fields to household and craft labor. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and mended garments, ensuring clothing layers were strong enough to withstand the cold. Men repaired tools, sharpened blades, and built or patched fences, preparing for spring planting. Children contributed by gathering kindling, fetching water from frozen wells, or helping tend animals. Even leisure was shaped by necessity. Storytelling by the fire reinforced communal bonds, while religious observances marked time and provided spiritual hope in months of physical deprivation. Illness shadowed every aspect of winter life. Cold and dampness encouraged respiratory diseases. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, allowing outbreaks of influenza, dysentery, or even plague. The closed quarters of cottages meant sickness spread quickly through families. Without effective medicine, peasants relied on herbal remedies, charms, and prayer. Some sought help from local wise women, while others turned to saints for intercession. But cures were uncertain, and death was frequent. Winter mortality was highest among the young and old, leaving scars on communities already stretched thin. Despite hardship, resilience defined peasant life. Customs and traditions provided psychological endurance. Midwinter festivals like Christmas offered brief respite, with feasting and celebration if supplies allowed. Candlemas in February marked the turning of the season, a reminder that light and warmth would eventually return. Folklore carried warnings and lessons, with tales of spirits and demons embodying the dangers of hunger or cold. These cultural practices were not mere entertainment. They were tools of survival, ways to endure the weight of endless winter nights. The communal nature of peasant villages also offered strength. Shared ovens, collective threshing, and mutual aid meant no family was entirely isolated. In times of scarcity, neighbors might share grain or firewood, though always at risk of depleting their own reserves. Survival often depended on these networks of obligation and reciprocity. Yet tensions ran high. Theft increased in famine years, as desperate peasants stole from barns or fields. Manorial records reveal punishments for such crimes, but they also testify to the desperation driving them. Winter tested not only bodies but social cohesion. Geography played a decisive role in the degree of burden. In southern Europe, milder winters eased survival, though drought and scarcity created their own threats. In northern regions, the season was harsher, with longer nights and deeper cold. Scandinavia, the Alps, and the eastern plains faced extremes that demanded greater reliance on preserved fish, hardy grains, and communal resilience. Yet across Europe, the same pattern held. Winter was feared, endured, and never fully escaped. The burden of peasants contrasted starkly with that of nobility. Lords and their households feasted in great halls, their tables laden with venison, boar, and imported luxuries. Yet even in castles, cold and scarcity were felt. Fires roared, but heat dissipated in vast stone chambers. Servants shivered in outer rooms. And nobles' abundance was built on peasant labor. Their survival depended on rents and tithes extracted from those who could least afford them. Winter revealed the hierarchy of medieval society, with hunger pressing hardest at the bottom. The cumulative weight of these struggles defined medieval life. Each winter brought losses: livestock that did not survive, fields that lay barren, neighbors who perished. Yet peasants adapted, endured, and rebuilt each spring. Their burden was immense, but without their labor and resilience, medieval society itself would have collapsed. The castles, churches, and kingdoms we remember were sustained by men and women who braved the cold each year, clinging to survival with little more than fire, bread, and determination. Winter, for peasants, was not a season of rest but a season of trial. It demanded labor, sacrifice, and unyielding resilience. It stripped life to its bare essentials: heat, food, shelter, and faith. Every frostbitten morning, every rationed loaf, every smoky fire was part of the struggle. This was a peasant's burden, a daily fight to survive against the coldest force of nature, endured with a quiet strength that defined the medieval world. In medieval Europe, the experience of winter was shaped as much by class as by climate. While peasants bore the heaviest burden of survival, nobles lived in a world defined by privilege, obligation, and display. Their lives in the cold months were far removed from the smoky cottages of the poor, yet winter still pressed against the walls of castles and manor houses. The nobility endured with more comfort, but not without struggle. For them, winter was both hardship and opportunity, a season when survival could be transformed into a demonstration of wealth and power. The walls of a castle offered protection against enemies and the elements alike. Built from stone, castles and fortified manors stood as imposing symbols of authority. But the same stone that resisted siege also absorbed dampness and cold. Great halls echoed with draughts, their vastness making warmth nearly impossible to maintain. Fires blazed in enormous hearths, logs the size of trees stacked and consumed daily, yet only those seated directly before the flames felt true heat. The farther one sat from the hearth, the more the chill crept back in. Nobles wrapped themselves in layers of wool, linen, and fur, their garments as much armor against the cold as against fashion's dictates. Servants bore the task of fueling these fires. Vast quantities of firewood or peat were gathered in autumn, often stored in castle yards or barns. In wealthy estates, coal was used, especially in regions like England where it was more accessible. The labor to gather, cut, haul, and distribute this fuel was immense. A single castle might consume entire forests over the course of a winter. Yet for the Lord, these blazing hearths were essential, not only for survival but for display. Fire symbolized power, the ability to command resources that others lacked. To let the hearth go dark would have signaled weakness. Food remained central to noble survival, but unlike peasants, lords turned necessity into spectacle. Their stores were larger, their diets more diverse, and their tables laden with the products of their estates. Venison, wild boar, and rabbits from hunting grounds supplied meat, while fish ponds and rivers provided freshwater catches. Salted, smoked, or dried provisions filled storerooms, supplemented by dairy, eggs, and imported goods like almonds, figs, and spices. Winter feasting became a display of abundance, a ritual that reassured both household and retainers that their lord's wealth could withstand the season's threats. Hunting was more than sport, it was survival and status combined. Winter hunts supplied fresh meat when livestock had been culled or fodder was scarce. Lords rode into forests with hounds, falcons, and retinues of men, pursuing deer, boar, or smaller game. Beyond sustenance, these hunts were performances of dominance over nature, reinforcing the idea that noble privilege extended even into the wild. The meat distributed from hunts often fed not only the noble household, but also retainers and dependents, further cementing loyalty in lean months. The rhythm of noble life in winter was shaped by the great hall. Here, the household gathered to eat, to conduct business, and to socialize. Meals were opportunities to demonstrate hierarchy, the lord and his family seated at the high table, retainers and servants below. The food, the warmth of the fire, the music of minstrels, all were orchestrated to project authority. Even in the darkest months, nobles maintained rituals of display, reminding all within the walls of the order that sustained medieval society. Religion too structured noble winters. Chapels within castles or nearby monasteries provided spaces for worship. Advent, Christmas, and Epiphany were celebrated with ceremony, blending faith with festivity. Feasts on holy days contrasted with fasting during Lent, reinforcing the seasonal rhythm of scarcity and plenty. Nobles patronized churches with donations of food or firewood, act that displayed piety while subtly reinforcing their role as providers in times of hardship. Despite abundance, nobles were not immune to winter's dangers. Cold and damp bred illness in castle chambers just as in peasant huts. Draughts carried coughs and fevers. Smoky holes irritated lungs. Epidemics of influenza or plague paid no heed to wealth. Malnutrition was less common among nobles, but even they could feel the effects of scarcity in years of widespread famine. Chronicles record noble households suffering reduced rations or abandoning feasts in times of crisis. The wealth of lords cushioned the blow but could not erase it entirely. The management of estates in winter was another form of burden. While peasants struggled to survive, nobles had to ensure their tenants endured as well, if only to secure rent and labor in the following year. Bailiffs and stewards monitored granaries, collected dues, and enforced discipline. Lords who failed to provide relief risked unrest, even rebellion. Thus, winter became a test of governance. Generosity in times of scarcity could win loyalty. Harshness could sow resentment. Nobles were expected to embody both strength and stewardship, their reputations as enduring as their walls. Beyond survival, winter offered opportunities for cultural life. Nobles hosted tournaments, feasts, and entertainments even in the coldest months. Frozen rivers and snow-covered fields became stages for sport. Skating, sleighing, and jousts in winter clothing amused courts, though such luxuries were far removed from peasant toil. Storytelling, music, and dance filled long nights, reinforcing bonds of culture and continuity. These events were not mere diversions. They projected resilience, showing that noble household could not only endure winter but thrive in it. Castles and manor houses themselves were symbols of winter survival. Their granaries stored abundance, their walls resisted cold winds, their fires blazed against darkness. To peasants looking upward, they represented both hope and oppression, the possibility of relief, but also the reminder that their own hunger sustained noble feasts. This duality was central to medieval life. The nobility's winter endurance rested on the labor, rent, and sacrifices of those who endured far harsher struggles outside the castle gates. Ultimately, nobles endured winter by transforming necessity into power. Where peasants saw survival, lords saw opportunity to hunt, to feast, to display their wealth, and to reinforce their authority. Yet beneath the grandeur lay the same truth that bound all medieval people: dependence on the harvest, the vulnerability to disease, and the unyielding dominance of the seasons. Winter humbled even kings, its cold pressing against stone walls as surely as against thatched huts. The nobility's survival, with its fires, feasts, and ceremonies, was more secure than that of the peasants. But it was not untouched by winter's trials. Their wealth allowed them to endure. Their power allowed them to display abundance. Yet their lives too were shaped by the same rhythms of scarcity and cold. Winter was a great equalizer, and though noble bore it differently, they too lived at the mercy of the season. In the medieval world, winter was not merely a season of cold and scarcity. It was also a spiritual ordeal. The darkness, hunger, and disease that came with the frost were interpreted through the lens of faith. Religion did more than provide meaning. It structured survival, offering both comfort and control. Churches, monasteries, and the rituals of the Christian calendar shaped how medieval people endured the hardest months of the year. The church was present in every aspect of life, from the humblest peasant hut to the grandest cathedral. In winter, when survival was precarious, its role became even more vital. The parish church was not only a house of worship, but also a gathering place, a center of community life. Here, villagers sought warmth, shared news, and turned to God for protection against the season's hardships. Bells rang to mark holy days and call the faithful to prayer, anchoring community in rhythms that gave structure to months otherwise dominated by uncertainty. For peasants, faith was a source of solace. The cold that gnawed at their bodies was explained as part of a divine order. Harsh winters could be seen as punishment for sin, while a mild season was understood as a blessing from God. Rituals and prayers sought divine intervention in the survival of crops, livestock, and families. Saints became intercessors in these struggles. Saint Blaise was invoked for protection against throat ailments worsened by the cold. Saint Anthony was called upon to guard against disease and hunger. Icons, charms, and pilgrimages reflected a constant effort to enlist the sacred in the battle against winter. The Christian calendar reinforced this connection. Winter coincided with some of the most important religious festivals of the year. Advent prepared communities for the coming of Christ, a season of fasting and prayer that culminated in the joy of Christmas. The Nativity was not only a spiritual celebration, but also an opportunity for communal relief, with feasts that brightened the darkest days. For peasants, even small moments of festivity, shared bread, a cup of ale, a carol sung together, were a reprieve from hunger and cold. Epiphany in early January extended this season of light, reminding the faithful of divine revelation. Candlemas in February marked the presentation of Christ at the temple and symbolized a gradual return of light to the world. Candles were blessed and distributed, their flame seen as a defense against darkness and illness. These rituals aligned religious symbolism with the natural rhythms of the season, giving meaning to endurance. Monasteries played an especially critical role in the winter months. As centers of learning, agriculture, and charity, they offered both practical and spiritual aid. Monks rose for prayers in unheated cloisters, their chants echoing through icy halls, demonstrating devotion that inspired the lay community. Monastic estates stored grain and foodstuffs, which could be distributed to the needy in times of famine. Almsgiving was both an act of piety and a means of maintaining social order, reinforcing the church's authority as a guardian of survival. In famine years, monasteries might become the only source of relief for entire villages. At the same time, religion imposed discipline. The church dictated periods of fasting even in the depths of winter. Lent, often falling during the hungry gap of late winter and early spring, required abstention from meat and dairy at a time when supplies were already low. For the faithful, fasting was a spiritual test, a chance to share in Christ's suffering. For peasants, it deepened the experience of scarcity. The church thus sanctified the hardships of winter, transforming hunger into a form of devotion. This dual role of comfort and control was central. Religion gave meaning to suffering, offering the hope of eternal salvation, but it also reinforced obedience to the existing order. Lords who provided alms were praised as Christian rulers. Peasants who endured hunger without rebellion were seen as virtuous. The church's authority grew from its ability to explain, regulate, and sanctify the rhythms of survival. Folklore and Christianity blended during the season. Pagan traditions of midwinter persisted, absorbed into Christian ritual. The Yule log, evergreen decorations, and feasting carried echoes of older customs, reinterpreted through the lens of Christ's birth. The church allowed many of these practices, channeling them into its calendar, ensuring that spiritual comfort was tied to Christian worship. This fusion enriched the cultural landscape of winter, making faith inseparable from festivity. The fear of famine and disease also magnified belief in divine punishment. Chronicles describe communities holding processions, carrying relics through villages to ward off pestilence or praying for mild weather. Priests preached sermons interpreting extreme winters as signs of God's wrath. In times of plenty, this reinforced gratitude. In times of suffering, it reinforced penitence. Religion thus shaped not only how people experienced winter, but also how they understood its cause. For the nobility, faith offered a different kind of reassurance. Lords sponsored churches, chapels, and monasteries as visible signs of piety. Their generosity, especially in providing food or firewood in harsh winters, reinforced their authority as Christian rulers. Religious ceremonies within castles bound households together, projecting an image of divine favor even as cold drafts swept through stone halls. Faith became part of the nobility's political identity, a means of legitimizing power in a season when hunger might otherwise challenge it. Yet faith was not unchallenged. In years of devastating famine, when prayers failed to bring relief, doubt crept in. Accounts of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 describe not only starvation but also despair. People questioned the justice of God, and some turned to superstition, blaming witches or spirits for their suffering. Still, the Church remained the primary interpreter of these crises, adapting its teachings to preserve authority. In this way, religion in winter functioned as both shield and chain. It comforted the fearful, sanctified the hungry, and controlled the desperate. It explained the unexplainable, turning the unpredictability of climate into a divine narrative. Without faith, the burden of winter might have been unbearable. With it, the season became part of a larger cosmic story. In the end, the endurance of medieval people through winter was as much spiritual as physical. Their fires and food sustained bodies, but their prayers and rituals sustained hope. The frost tested faith as surely as it tested flesh, and for centuries, the Church held the power to interpret survival itself. In the medieval world, winters were always feared, but there were times when the season did not simply test survival. It broke it. There were years when the cold lingered, when rains destroyed harvests, when hunger spread from village to village until famine consumed entire kingdoms. For medieval Europe, the most infamous of these crises came between 1315 and 1317, in what chroniclers later remembered as a Great Famine. It was a time when the balance between nature and humanity shattered, when winter seemed endless, and when millions paid the price. The Great Famine was triggered not by war or plague, but by weather. Beginning in the spring of 1315, heavy rain swept across northern Europe. They continued through summer, ruining grain harvests. Crops rotted in waterlogged fields, and hay for animals could not be gathered. The rains returned in 1316 and 1317, leaving farmers powerless. The climate shift that historians associate with the Little Ice Age had begun to assert itself, bringing colder temperatures, erratic weather, and shorter growing seasons. Nature itself had turned hostile, and Europe's reliance on subsistence agriculture made the consequences catastrophic. The impact was immediate. Grain prices doubled, then tripled as supplies dwindled. Families that had enough food in ordinary years suddenly faced hunger. The poor were hit hardest, unable to purchase what little grain remained. Bread, the foundation of survival, became a luxury. Chroniclers noted people eating cats, dogs, and even roots pulled from the ground. Livestock perished in muddy fields, fodder exhausted. Salt, needed to preserve meat, became scarce when trade routes faltered. Without food or preservation, survival became a desperate improvisation. Starvation spread rapidly. In England, France, the Low Countries, and much of the German states, mortality rose sharply. It is estimated that between 10 and 15% of Europe's population perished in these 3 years. Peerage records reveal spikes in burials during late winter and early spring. The dreaded hungry gap magnified into catastrophe. The famine struck rich and poor alike, though inequality deepened its toll. Nobles hoarded supplies, monasteries distributed alms but could not meet demand, and peasants bore the brunt of hunger. The social consequences were profound. Families were torn apart as parents abandoned children they could not feed. Accounts from the period describe mothers smothering infants to spare them starvation. In cities, beggars crowded streets, overwhelming civic resources. Theft and violence increased, with grain stores raided and travelers attacked for food. Even graveyards were not spared, with reports of bodies dug up for consumption in the darkest hours of famine. Whether exaggerated or not, such accounts reveal the desperation that defined these years. Disease compounded the crisis. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, and epidemics spread easily among the hungry. Dysentery, typhoid, and respiratory illnesses claimed countless lives. Some historians argue that the famine left Europe more vulnerable to the Black Death a generation later, its survivors weakened by years of hunger and recurring scarcity. The Great Famine was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a broader cycle of vulnerability in a world where nature held the upper hand. The famine also revealed the limits of authority. Kings and lords struggled to respond. Edward II of England attempted to import grain from abroad, but storms and blockades hampered shipments. In France, Philip V issued decrees to stabilize prices, but markets defied regulation. Lords distributed food to loyal tenants, but such charity could not address the scale of need. The Church called for processions, prayers, and penance, interpreting the rains as divine punishment. Yet as hunger deepened, confidence in both secular and spiritual leaders faltered. Monasteries, often centers of relief, were overwhelmed. Their stores were emptied, their arms unable to reach the multitudes in need. In some areas, monks themselves went hungry. The famine tested the resilience of institutions, revealing both their capacity for charity and their inability to confront disaster on this scale. Faith endured, but it was tested by the sight of unrelieved suffering. The psychological impact of the Great Famine was immense. For those who lived through it, the memory lingered as a scar. Generations spoke of the years when bread vanished, when neighbors died, when winter seemed to stretch without end. Folklore absorbed these memories, weaving famine into cautionary tales of sin, punishment, and divine wrath. Chroniclers wrote of the famine with horror, their accounts filled with images of decay and despair. It became part of Europe's collective memory, a reminder of how fragile survival was in a world ruled by the seasons. The Great Famine was not unique. Other famines struck in different centuries, each tied to climate shifts, failed harvests, or war. In Scandinavia, harsh winters regularly brought hunger, with entire villages wiped out by starvation. In Ireland, the combination of cold and poor harvests in the 14th century devastated rural communities. In Russia, famines recurred through the Middle Ages, exacerbated by long winters and political upheaval. Each famine revealed the same truth. Medieval society lived on the edge of survival, and winter could tip it into collapse. What made 1315 to 1317 so devastating was its scale. It touched nearly all of Northern Europe, erasing any possibility of relief through trade or migration. Regions that in ordinary years might have aided one another now suffered simultaneously. For the first time in centuries, famine became continental. This universality magnified its impact, ensuring that no one could truly escape. Recovery was slow. By 1318, weather improved and harvests returned to normal, but the population had been reduced by millions. Fields lay fallow where villages had been abandoned. Families never recovered their lost members. The famine reshaped demographics, politics, and even spirituality. It reminded rulers that their authority was fragile when nature turned hostile. It reminded peasants that survival was precarious, subject to forces beyond their control. And it foreshadowed the even greater catastrophe to come, the Black Death of the mid-14th century. The famine years demonstrate the deep interconnection between climate, society, and survival. They were not merely episodes of hunger, but moments when the medieval world revealed its fragility. Stone castles, royal decrees, and church rituals could not overcome the failure of harvests. Winter, extended and merciless, humbled all. In the medieval imagination, famine was more than a disaster. It was a theological event. Chroniclers wrote of God's anger, of human sinfulness, of the need for repentance. For the common people, famine was both a test and a sentence. It shaped their faith, their communities, and their memories. Winter became more than a season. It became a specter that haunted generations, a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. When we look back on these years, we see not only tragedy but resilience. Millions perished, but millions endured, carrying the memory forward. Their endurance ensured that Europe survived to face new challenges, even as the famine left scars that lasted for centuries. The famine years stand as testimony to the limits of human power in the face of nature's wrath, a stark reminder that, in the medieval world, winter was not simply endured. Sometimes it won. Hunger and cold were the most visible enemies of medieval winter. But often, death came not from an empty stomach or frostbitten skin. It came from the invisible specter of disease. Winter was a season when sickness thrived, fueled by poor nutrition, cramped living conditions, and weakened bodies. For medieval people, illness was as inevitable as the snow, and when it struck, it could sweep through entire communities, leaving devastation in its wake. The connection between hunger and sickness was immediate. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, leaving bodies unable to fight infection. During the hungry gap of late winter, when food stores were nearly exhausted, peasants consumed whatever remained, sometimes molded bread, spoiled grain, or even bark and roots. Contaminated food carried risks of poisoning or infection. Ergot, a fungus that grew on rye during damp harvests, produced terrifying symptoms: convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene. Known as St. Anthony's fire, it ravaged villages, particularly in years of scarcity. Malnourished and poisoned, people were vulnerable to every cough, fever, and outbreak that winter brought. The structure of medieval homes amplified the risk. Families crowded into one or two rooms, sharing space not only with each other but often with livestock. Smoke from open hearths irritated lungs, causing chronic coughs and respiratory illness. Damp floors bred mold, while lice and fleas carried parasites. In such conditions, even minor illnesses became deadly. A simple fever might sweep through a household, leaving the elderly and children lifeless by spring. Respiratory diseases were particularly common in winter. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and influenza circulated relentlessly. The cold air, combined with smoke-filled rooms, worsened breathing problems. Coughs and fevers were constant companions, often described in parish records as causes of death during the coldest months. Without medical knowledge of germs, these illnesses were often explained as divine punishment or bad air, what medieval physicians called miasma. Remedies were limited to herbal infusions, bleeding, or charms, none of which addressed the underlying causes. Diarrheal diseases also flourished. Water sources froze, forcing people to drink from stagnant or contaminated supplies. Food preservation methods, though ingenious, were imperfect. Salted fish or meat could spoil, and when consumed, they caused illness that spread rapidly in cramped conditions. Dysentery and typhoid cut through weakened populations, leaving entire families stricken. In urban centers, poor sanitation magnified the threat, with waste accumulating in frozen streets until thaws spread it into water supplies. The great plagues that haunt medieval history also bore connections to winter. The Black Death of the mid-14th century is often associated with summer outbreaks, but its spread was accelerated by cycles of famine and cold. Malnourished populations, already weakened by the harsh winters and poor harvests of the early 14th century, were more susceptible when plague struck. Later waves of the plague recurred in winter as well, with towns sealing gates and imposing quarantines in desperate attempt to contain infection. Cold slowed travel, but it did not halt the march of disease. Monasteries and hospitals provided some relief, but also became centers of contagion. The sick gathered in close quarters, spreading illness even as clerics and healers tended to them. Monks and nuns, bound by vows of service, often perished alongside those they tried to help. Religious orders saw these sacrifices as holy, yet communities lost valuable leaders in the process. In times of epidemic, entire monasteries were emptied, their cloisters falling silent as death claimed one after another. For the peasantry, disease was often endured with fatalism. Remedies were passed down through oral tradition, teas made from elderflower for coughs, garlic to ward off infection, vinegar washes for wounds. Charms, amulets, and prayers supplemented these treatments, blending faith with medicine. Physicians were rare in villages and costly in towns, their treatments inaccessible to most. Even when available, medieval medicine rested on humoral theory, the belief that illness was caused by imbalances of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatments like bloodletting or purging often weakened patients further. The church framed disease in moral and spiritual terms. Illness was punishment for sin or trial sent by God. Confession, prayer, and penance were prescribed as often as herbs or diets. Saints were invoked as protectors. Saint Roch for plague, Saint Blaise for throat ailments, Saint Apollonia for toothaches. Pilgrimages to shrines promised healing, though many who undertook them never returned. For the faithful, illness was as much a spiritual battle as a physical one. Disease carried social consequences. Outbreaks destabilized communities, halting trade, delaying rent, and straining obligations. Fear of contagion led to isolation. Villages sometimes barred strangers, towns closed gates, and families abandoned the sick. In extreme cases, scapegoats were sought. Jews, lepers, and other marginalized groups were accused of poisoning wells or bringing divine wrath, leading to persecution. In times of mass death, fear magnified division as much as faith fostered unity. The specter of disease was not limited to the poor. Nobles and kings fell ill as readily as peasants. Their stone walls no defense against infection. Chroniclers recorded the deaths of rulers from fevers, plagues, or mysterious ailments, their power cut short by unseen forces. Yet nobles could access better care, heated chambers, more nourishing diets, and the services of physicians. Still, mortality remained high across all classes. Disease ignored status, cutting down rich and poor alike. The cumulative effect of winter disease was demographic pressure. Populations grew slowly in the Middle Ages, constantly checked by cycles of famine, plague, and cold. Entire villages vanished under the combined weight of hunger and illness. Survivors endured but carried scars, malformed bones from malnutrition, weakened lungs from chronic respiratory illness, and a cultural memory of fear. Generations grew up with the expectation that winter would bring not only hunger but sickness, shaping their understanding of life, death, and faith. The resilience of medieval communities lay not in conquering disease, but in surviving it year after year. They endured through shared care, religious devotion, and cultural acceptance of mortality. Death was not hidden but ever present, recorded in parish registers, marked in churchyards, and memorialized in prayers. Winter disease reinforced a medieval worldview. Life was fleeting, suffering was universal, and salvation was the ultimate hope. The specter of disease haunted every medieval winter. It stalked through smoky huts and cold castles, traveled along trade routes and pilgrimage paths, and erupted in times of famine and cold. To live in the Middle Ages was to live with a constant presence of sickness, an enemy as feared as hunger or war. Winter did not invent disease, but it made its grip tighter, its consequences deadlier. For medieval people, each cough in the cold air, each fever by the hearth, was a reminder how thin the line between survival and death truly was. War has always been a defining force in human history, but in the medieval world, the battlefield was not only shaped by swords, shields, and strategy, it was shaped by the weather. In summer, armies marched and laid siege with relative ease. But when winter descended, the cold became as deadly as any weapon. Snow, frost, and hunger could undo even the mightiest king's ambitions. Armies in the Middle Ages were often at the mercy of the season, and winter warfare exposed the fragility of medieval logistics, strategy, and survival. Unlike in modern times, medieval armies had no permanent supply chains, no railroads, and no centralized depots to sustain them. They lived largely off the land, requisitioning or plundering food from local populations. In summer, this was difficult but manageable. In winter, it became nearly impossible. Fields lay barren, livestock was slaughtered down to the minimum, and stored grain was hidden or fiercely guarded by peasants. Foraging in winter was a desperate gamble, often yielding too little for the hundreds or thousands of mouths in an army. Hunger stalked soldiers as surely as it did the villages they encountered. Campaigning in winter demanded foresight, yet even kings and generals underestimated the season's power. Horses, vital for knights and transport, required vast amounts of fodder. In cold months, grass was scarce, and hay was already stretched thin to feed peasant herds. Cavalry, the pride of medieval armies, grew weak, their animals collapsing from hunger. Without horses, mobility vanished, and supply wagons stalled. Winter immobilized armies as effectively as any fortress wall. Sieges, a cornerstone of medieval warfare, were particularly brutal in winter. Attacking armies had to encamp outside stone walls, exposed to snow and wind. Tents and makeshift shelters offered little protection. Fires consumed precious wood, and food supplies dwindled. Disease spread rapidly in crowded, unsanitary camps. Defenders inside castles fared better, their granaries and thick walls providing more security, though they too feared starvation if the siege dragged on. The cold turned sieges into waiting games, where endurance mattered more than strategy. One of the most famous examples of winter warfare came during the Mongol invasions of Eastern Europe in the 13th century. The Mongols, masters of mobility, adapted to the season, their horses able to graze even in snowy fields. Their campaigns in Poland and Hungary in 1241 demonstrated how armies that embraced winter could devastate opponents unprepared for it. European forces, dependent on supply chains and unaccustomed to fighting in deep cold, collapsed under the Mongol advance. The invasions showed that winter could be weaponized when armies planned for it. In Western Europe, kings often avoided winter campaigns, yet circumstances sometimes forced them. During the 100 Years' War between England and France, both sides launched raids known as chevauchées, burning villages and seizing supplies. In winter, these raids became especially cruel, as they deprived populations of the little food and shelter they had. Armies might not win decisive battles in snow, but they could starve enemies into submission by devastating the countryside at its weakest moment. Northern Europe presented its own challenges. In Scandinavia and the Baltic, frozen rivers and lakes became highways for armies. Campaigns could move swiftly across ice that in summer would have been impassable swamps or water barriers. Yet the same ice could betray them. Chronicles tell of soldiers and horses plunging through thin ice, swallowed by freezing water. The opportunity was great, but the risks were lethal. Winter turned landscapes into shifting battlegrounds, where survival depended on reading the environment as much as reading the enemy. The Crusades also revealed winter's influence. While much of the campaigning occurred in warmer climates, the European soldiers who marched east often endured brutal winters along the way. During the First Crusade, the army's march through Anatolia in 1097-98 was marked by freezing conditions and starvation. Chroniclers recorded men boiling horse hides for sustenance and dying in droves from exposure. These accounts show that even in distant lands, the specter of winter remained a universal enemy. Logistics remained the greatest obstacle. Supplying an army in winter required immense planning, with stockpiles of grain, salted meat, and firewood gathered in advance. Even then, transport was fraught with difficulty. Roads became muddy quagmires or impassable drifts. Wagons broke, oxen collapsed, and soldiers carried loads on their backs. Armies slowed to a crawl, vulnerable to ambush and exhaustion. A campaign launched in winter risked collapse before battle was even joined. Yet for all its dangers, winter warfare held strategic advantages. An enemy might not expect attack in cold months, leaving castles or towns vulnerable. Armies that endured could achieve surprise, catching foes unprepared. Winter offensives could devastate morale, proving a leader's resolve. For rulers desperate to assert dominance, the risks of winter campaigns were sometimes outweighed by the potential rewards. But the gamble was immense, and more often than not, the season proved a stronger adversary. Disease was as much an enemy as the cold itself. Encamped armies, weakened by hunger, saw outbreaks of dysentery, fevers, and respiratory illness. Physicians, bound by humoral theory, prescribed bleeding, purges, or herbal remedies, but these rarely helped. The dead filled makeshift graves, and morale plummeted. Winter claimed soldiers silently, reducing armies without a single clash of arms. Generals feared attrition more than battle, knowing that by spring their forces might be decimated without striking a blow. Winter also reshaped the psychology of war. Soldiers endured not only physical suffering but the erosion of will. Cold nights in tattered tents, empty bellies, and endless marches through snow drained courage. Chroniclers described frostbitten hands too numb to hold weapons, men deserting camps to seek food, and knights dismounting from starving horses to march alongside common soldiers. The chivalric image of war clashed with the grim reality of survival. Winter stripped war of its pageantry, exposing its brutality. For peasants caught in the path of winter campaigns, suffering multiplied. Armies requisitioned or looted what little food remained in villages, leaving families to starve. Barns were emptied, homes burned, and fields trampled. Winter warfare turned the already fragile existence of peasants into catastrophe. Their plight was collateral damage in the strategies of kings and lords, yet it was often their hunger that determined the endurance of armies. In this way, winter warfare was not confined to the battlefield. It devastated entire societies. Even in later centuries of the medieval period, winter remained a decisive force. The wars of the Teutonic Knights and the Baltic depended on the season, with frozen rivers enabling campaigns against pagan strongholds. But when winters were too harsh or supplies too thin, even these formidable warriors faltered. Climate dictated conquest as much as steel. Ultimately, winter warfare exposed the limits of medieval power. Kings commanded armies, knights carried lances, but no ruler could command the weather. The cold humbled ambitions, reminding all that nature was the ultimate arbiter. Victories won in winter were rare and costly, bought with suffering as great as any battle. Defeats, by contrast, came swiftly as armies withered without a fight. The history of medieval war cannot be told without winter. It was an adversary always present, shaping campaigns, testing armies, and often deciding outcomes before swords ever clashed. Winter warfare was a struggle not only between men but between humanity and nature itself. In the frozen fields and snowbound camps of the Middle Ages, the cold was the deadliest weapon of all. In the medieval world, winter was more than a season of hardship. It was also a season of togetherness. When the fields lay frozen and days dwindled to short hours of pale light, survival depended not only on food and fire but on the strength of community. The hearth, the blazing center of every household, whether peasant hut or castle hall, was more than a practical necessity. It was a symbol of life, a gathering point that bound families and neighbors together against the darkness outside. In the struggle against cold and scarcity, community was as vital as fuel and bread. For peasants, the hearth was the heart of the home. In cottages of wattle and daub, a central fire burned constantly, smoke rising through a hole in the roof or seeping through thatch. Families gathered around its glow to eat, work, and sleep. The fire provided heat, cooked meals, dried clothes, and offered a fragile defense against frostbite. Its presence was so essential that laws in some villages required households to share embers with neighbors if a fire went out. To be without a flame in midwinter was to face death, and no community could afford to let one of its members freeze alone. The communal nature of survival extended beyond individual households. In villages, ovens were often shared, with women baking bread for multiple families in large clay or stone structures. These ovens became meeting points where news and stories were exchanged while loaves baked. In the long dark months, when isolation bred despair, such encounters reinforced bonds that held communities together. Shared tasks like threshing grain, salting meat, or brewing ale often became collective efforts, each family contributing labor and resources. Mutual aid was not a luxury, it was a difference between endurance and collapse. Festivals and religious observances reinforced these bonds. The Christmas season was one of the few times when even poor households tried to feast, pooling resources to celebrate. Ale was brewed, animals slaughtered, and fires burned brightly for a brief period of relief. Wassailing traditions, in which groups sang and shared drink from house to house, emphasized generosity and hospitality. These customs were not only cultural expressions but survival strategies, redistributing resources across the community during the leanest time of year. Storytelling, too, was a form of sustenance. Around the hearth, elders recounted tales of saints, local legends, and cautionary myths that carried moral lessons. These stories provided entertainment but also continuity, connecting generations through shared memory. They offered meaning to suffering and reinforced cultural values of endurance, faith, and solidarity. The hearth was not only a place of warmth, but also a place where knowledge, belief, and hope were passed down in the darkest months. In noble households, the principle was the same, though expressed on a grander scale. The great hall of a castle or manor was dominated by an immense hearth, where logs the size of men blazed. Nobles, retainers, and guests gathered for feasts, music, and storytelling, while servants bustled to keep fires fed and tables supplied. The fire's glow illuminated tapestries and banners, reinforcing the impression of abundance and order. Yet even here, the hearth was more than display. It bound the household together, providing warmth and companionship in a season when isolation could be as dangerous as hunger. The communal role of fire extended to villages struck by disaster. When famine or illness threatened, communities often turned to the church, where candles and braziers glowed during vigils and processions. Religious ceremonies that invoked warmth and light, such as Candlemas in February, were not merely symbolic. They reassured the faithful that together, guided by faith, they could withstand the season's trials. The church itself became a communal hearth, offering both physical and spiritual warmth. The importance of shared fire was underscored by the dangers of its absence. In remote homesteads or isolated cottages, loneliness magnified the hardships of winter. Records describe individuals who perished not from lack of food but from lack of companionship, their fires gone cold as illness or despair took hold. In contrast, communities that maintained strong networks of mutual aid fared better, even in famine years. Medieval society understood that survival was collective, and the hearth was its emblem. Hearth-centered life also shaped social customs. Marriage feasts in winter often emphasized the joining of households around a single fire, symbolizing unity. Hospitality became a moral duty, with travelers and the poor welcomed to share warmth. Inns and taverns, heated by large fires, served as hubs where strangers gathered, exchanged news, and found refuge. These spaces reflected the broader medieval understanding that winter survival required more than individual effort. It demanded shared resilience. The communal hearth even influenced architecture. Houses were clustered close together in villages, reducing exposure to winds and allowing neighbors to assist each other quickly. In towns, narrow streets and dense housing preserved warmth, though at the cost of fire risk. Castles and monasteries were designed with central hearths or multiple fireplaces, ensuring that large groups could share in their warmth. The design of medieval living spaces reflected the central truth that survival in winter was a collective endeavor, with fire at its heart. Even conflict could not entirely erase the role of hearth in community. Chronicles describe villages attacked during winter raids, where survivors sought refuge around hastily built fires in the ruins of their homes. In war and peace alike, the instinct was the same: gather around the flame, share what little remained, and endure together. Fire symbolized continuity, the thread that bound people through destruction and deprivation. Psychologically, the hearth served as a bulwark against despair. In a season when days were short and nights long, when hunger gnawed and disease spread, the glow of fire reminded people of life's persistence. The laughter of children, the murmur of prayers, the crackle of wood, all were signs that, despite the cold beyond the door, the household endured. This resilience was as important as any material resource. It fostered hope, the invisible fuel that carried communities through the bleakest winters. The story of medieval winter is thus not only one of hunger, cold, and disease, but also one of solidarity. Fire and frost defined the boundaries of survival. Alone, a family might falter. Together, a community could endure. The hearth was more than warmth. It was the axis of medieval life, where survival was negotiated, culture was preserved, and hope was sustained. In the endless struggle against winter, the hearth glowed as humanity's greatest defense. Its flames lit not only homes but also hearts, binding medieval people together in the knowledge that survival was never an individual achievement. It was a communal triumph, fought each year in the flicker of firelight against the frost. Winter in the medieval world was a season of extremes, of abundance and celebration on one hand, and of scarcity and suffering on the other. The cycle began with the great feast of midwinter, when communities gathered around hearths and tables to mark holy days with joy and ritual. But as weeks passed and stores dwindled, the cheer of Christmas and Epiphany gave way to the gnawing anxiety of hunger. This period of transition, from feasting to famine, defined the rhythm of medieval survival. It was a story of brief relief followed by long endurance, of light and darkness followed by the return of want. At the start of winter, celebrations broke the monotony of cold and toil. Christmas was the centerpiece of the medieval calendar, a feast that lasted not a day but 12, culminating in Epiphany. Lords and peasants alike joined in festivities, though on vastly different scales. In great halls, nobles hosted banquets where venison, boar, and swan were roasted, spiced with costly imports from the East. Tables groaned under platters of pies, custards, and sugared fruits, accompanied by ale, mead, and wine. Music filled the halls, minstrels sang, and games of masks entertained guests deep into the night. In villages, the fare was simpler but no less significant. Families slaughtered animals they could not afford to feed through winter, preserving the meat and sharing fresh portions in communal feasts. Ale brewed in autumn was consumed, bread baked from the first stores of grain, and vegetables from autumn's harvest added to stews. Neighbors gathered, sang carols, and shared warmth around fires. These moments were as much about psychological relief as physical nourishment. They reminded people that even in the darkest season, life could be celebrated. Feasting also carried religious meaning. Christmas celebrated the birth of Christ, light entering a darkened world. Candlemas in February marked purification and renewal, symbolizing the gradual return of light. These feasts tied survival to the divine, transforming food and celebration into rituals of faith. They reassured communities that suffering was part of a cosmic cycle, balanced by moments of joy and salvation. But abundance never lasted. As the weeks of winter wore on, stores diminished. Meat salted or smoked in December dwindled. Ale casks ran dry, and bread became coarser as finer grains were exhausted. By February and March, the hungry gap set in. This was the season between the exhaustion of old stores and the arrival of new crops, when hunger became widespread and despair grew. It was not the coldest months that were most feared, but these late weeks of waiting, when resources ran out and fields still lay barren. For peasants, the hungry gap was the greatest trial of the year. Grain bins emptied, forcing families to stretch meals with peas, beans, or even ground acorns. Bread was mixed with whatever fillers could be found, bran, chaff, or even sawdust in extreme cases. Pottage, the daily stew, grew thinner, often reduced to water flavored with scraps. Malnutrition weakened bodies, leaving people vulnerable to disease. Parish records show mortality spiking in these months, especially among children and the elderly. Nobles, too, felt the strain, though less acutely. Their stores were larger, their estates provided more resources. But even in castles, the hungry gap could be felt. Imported luxuries became scarcer, preserved food spoiled, and larders emptied. Feasts became fewer, tables less lavish. Chroniclers note that even kings sometimes reduced rations in lean years, a visible reminder that winter respected no one entirely. The hungry gap had profound social consequences. Theft increased, with desperate peasants raiding barns or stealing from neighbors. Lords faced unrest if they demanded rents when tenants could barely feed themselves. Some estates provided relief, distributing grain or opening stores, act of generosity that bound tenants' loyalty. Others enforced obligations harshly, deepening resentment and suffering. In towns, civic authorities sometimes attempted to regulate prices or import food, but success was limited. Scarcity frayed social bonds, revealing the fragility of medieval order. Religious life adapted to these rhythms. Lent often fell within the hungry gap, demanding fasting and abstention from meat at the very moment when scarcity was greatest. For the faithful, this was a spiritual trial, aligning human suffering with Christ's sacrifice. But it also intensified hardship, leaving people even weaker. Some bishops allowed dispensations in times of extreme famine, but often the discipline of fasting held firm, sanctifying hunger as devotion. Communities developed strategies to endure. Root vegetables stored in cellars, turnips, parsnips, carrots, were rationed carefully. Forage foods such as nettles, wild herbs, or nut-supplemented diets. Fishing, where possible, provided protein, especially in coastal areas. In some regions, the hungry gap spurred migration, with families leaving villages temporarily to seek work or food elsewhere. Survival required resilience, ingenuity, and above all patience. The hope of spring carried people through. The contrast between feast and famine was not accidental. It was built into medieval life. Feasts at the start of winter allowed communities to consume fresh resources before they spoiled, to celebrate survival after the harvest. The hungry gap was the inevitable consequence of that cycle, a reminder that abundance was temporary. Together, they shaped the medieval worldview. Life was a balance of joy and suffering, plenty and want, light and darkness. The cultural memory of feast and famine endured across generations. Songs, tales, and sermons warned of the dangers of gluttony in times of plenty and praised endurance in times of want. The rhythm of celebration followed by deprivation became part of the moral landscape, reinforcing values of moderation, charity, and faith. To waste food in feast time was to risk hunger in famine time. To share during want was to embody Christian virtue. The cycle also shaped power. Nobles who provided lavish feasts reinforced their authority, proving their wealth and generosity. Lords who supported tenants in the hungry gap won loyalty, while those who did not face rebellion. The church used feast days to emphasize divine providence, and fasting to remind communities of human dependence on God. In this way, feast and famine were not merely biological experiences but political and spiritual forces, woven into the fabric of medieval life. The story of the winter feast and the hungry gap is a story of contrasts, of laughter and hunger, firelight and despair, abundance and emptiness. It reveals how medieval people endured the season not only with bread and ale but with culture, faith, and solidarity. The feast reminded them of joy, the hungry gap reminded them of endurance, and together they defined what it meant to live in a world at the mercy of the seasons. For medieval people, winter was not only survived, it was lived as a rhythm of feast and famine, a cycle that echoed the broader truths of their existence. Life was fleeting, suffering was certain, but joy could be found even in darkness. And when the hungry gap seemed endless, they looked to spring, to the return of growth and light, as proof that survival was possible and that life, however fragile, endured. In the medieval struggle for survival, no group was more vulnerable to the cold months than children. Fragile bodies, underdeveloped immune systems, and dependence on adults made them the first to suffer when hunger and frost descended. For medieval families, every winter carried a silent dread that the youngest would not see the spring. Childhood itself was shaped by this reality. To be born in the Middle Ages was to enter a world where survival was never guaranteed, and where winter posed the greatest test of all. Infant mortality in medieval Europe was staggering. Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 3 children died before the age of 5. Winter intensified this risk. Newborns delivered in the cold months entered a hostile environment from their first breath. Peasant cottages were smoky, damp, and poorly insulated. A central fire provided some warmth, but drafts crept through thatch and wattle walls, and temperatures often remained near freezing indoors. Without modern heating, keeping a baby warm was a constant challenge. Swaddling in layers of cloth helped, but it also restricted movement and sometimes caused suffocation or infection. For many families, even basic warmth was beyond reach. Nutrition posed another threat. Breastfeeding was the foundation of infant survival, but for mothers weakened by malnutrition during the hungry gap, milk was scarce or poor in quality. In such cases, infants were fed animal milk or thin gruel, substitutes that often led to illness. Contaminated water mixed into food carried dysentery, which was frequently fatal for young children. Those who survived infancy faced the next hurdle, enduring the long, hungry winters of early childhood. Disease preyed heavily on the young. Cold, damp air fostered respiratory illnesses, pneumonia, bronchitis, tuberculosis, that claimed countless lives. Fevers and coughs, often brushed aside in adults, became deadly in children. In crowded cottages, sickness spread quickly among siblings. Epidemics such as measles, smallpox, and whooping cough swept through villages with devastating results. Malnutrition compounded the danger, leaving young bodies unable to recover. Each winter was a gauntlet, and many did not make it through. The hungry gap was particularly cruel to children. When grain stores ran low and meals grew thin, it was the young who felt it most. Stunted growth, weakened bones, and delayed development left lasting scars even in survivors. Archaeological studies of medieval skeletons reveal signs of childhood malnutrition, lines on teeth from interrupted growth, bowed legs from rickets, and small stature compared to modern populations. These physical marks tell the silent story of winters endured in want. Families face impossible choices. In times of extreme scarcity, food was rationed, often prioritizing adults who could work the fields or defend the household. Children sometimes received less, their survival subordinated to the community's immediate needs. Chronicles and legal record even describe cases of infanticide or abandonment during famines, desperate acts by parents unable to feed another mouth. While shocking to modern sensibilities, such decisions reflected the brutal calculus of survival in a world where resources were too scarce to save everyone. Despite these hardships, medieval communities did not view children as disposable. They were cherished as the future of the family and the village, but their fragility was an accepted fact of life. Baptism within days of birth reflected both religious duty and fear of early death. The church emphasized the importance of saving a child's soul, even if their body did not survive. Graves of infants and young children are found in nearly every medieval cemetery, testimony to the scale of loss. For parents, grief was a regular companion, yet life demanded resilience. Families mourned but moved forward, knowing that survival of the living depended on endurance. Noble children were not spared, though their lives offered more protection. Castles provided stronger walls against the cold, richer diets, and access to physicians. Yet wealth could not prevent death. Chroniclers record the deaths of princes and princesses from fevers, infections, and epidemics, often in winter months. Noble families invested heavily in wet nurses, herbal remedies, and heated chambers, but these measures offered limited security. Even kings could not shield their heirs entirely from the season's dangers. The cultural memory of child mortality shaped medieval attitudes toward family and society. Childhood was seen as fleeting, a fragile stage that might end at any moment. Parents often had many children, both as a hedge against loss and as a necessity for labor in the household economy. Communities shared in child-rearing, with neighbors assisting when mothers felt ill or food was scarce. The survival of children was understood as a communal responsibility, reinforcing social bonds in times of hardship. Religion provided both comfort and explanation. The deaths of children were interpreted as God's will, their souls entering heaven free of sin. Saints were invoked as protectors of the young, and charms or amulets were used to ward off illness. Feast days such as the Feast of the Holy Innocents in December reinforced the sanctity of children, even as their deaths were an accepted reality. Faith softened grief but also reinforced obedience, reminding families that survival and loss alike were part of divine order. Education and play, where possible, also reflected the season. In winter, children helped with indoor tasks, spinning wool, shelling peas, tending fires. They learned survival skills early, contributing to the household from the age of 5 or 6. Play still existed, with games in the snow or stories told around the hearth, but it was always overshadowed by the struggle for endurance. Childhood joy was never separated from the awareness of danger. The harsh reality of winter survival left deep imprints on medieval society. Every adult remembered the siblings they had lost. Every parent bore the grief of children buried too soon. This constant presence of death shaped medieval values: humility, faith, and endurance. The fragility of childhood was not hidden but acknowledged, woven into the culture's understanding of life itself. In the end, children of the frost symbolized both the peril and hope of the medieval winter. Their survival was uncertain, but their presence gave meaning to endurance. Families bore the season's trials not only for themselves, but for the possibility of carrying the next generation through. Each child who survived was a victory against the cold, a fragile promise that life will continue despite the odds. The story of children in the medieval winter is a story of vulnerability, loss, and resilience. It reminds us that survival was not only measured in food and fire, but in the ability of families and communities to protect their youngest. In a world where most did not survive beyond youth, every child who endured was a testament to the strength of human determination against the unyielding frost. In the medieval struggle against winter, survival was never only a matter of harvests and supplies. It was also a matter of labor, endless, invisible work carried out by women. From noble ladies to peasant wives, women bore the weight of keeping households alive during the coldest months. Their roles as caretakers, providers, and preservers of tradition made them indispensable. In every smoky cottage, manor hall, and cloistered convent, it was women who tended the hearth, rationed the food, and carried families through the frost. For peasant women, the responsibilities of winter began long before the first snow fell. In autumn, they worked alongside men in the fields, bringing in the harvest that would sustain the community. But once the stores were gathered, the burden of management fell heavily on their shoulders. Women oversaw granaries, root cellars, and pantries, deciding how much to use and how much to save. Their skill in stretching supplies often determined whether a family endured until spring. Each loaf of bread, each pot of pottage, was a calculation of survival measured and rationed with care. The hearth was their domain, both symbolically and practically. Peasant women kept the fire burning, rising before dawn to light kindling, baking bread in communal ovens, and cooking meals that eat the most from meager supplies. In the hungry gap of late winter, they foraged for wild greens, nettles, and herbs to supplement diets, knowledge passed down through generations of women. They preserved what they could, drying beans, salting fish, smoking meat, work that often began in autumn but carried its weight in February and March, when fresh food was gone. Their expertise in food preservation was not only labor but science, honed by centuries of necessity. Child care was another pressing responsibility. Winter was dangerous for children, and women bore the brunt of protection. They swaddled infants, soothed fevers, and applied herbal remedies to coughs and wounds. In smoky cottages where disease spread quickly, their care was often the only line of defense. Midwives attended births even in the bitterest cold, walking miles through snow to reach laboring mothers. Many midwives also served as healers, their knowledge of herbs and poultices making them central figures in community survival. Women's work extended beyond their own families. Villages often relied on collective female labor to keep order during winter. Women gathered to spin wool, weave cloth, or brew ale, turning tasks into communal events that reinforced solidarity. These gatherings were not only practical but social, easing the psychological burden of isolation. Gossip, storytelling, and song provided comfort, strengthening bonds that would carry them through the bleakest days. In this way, women became the glue of the community, ensuring not only survival of bodies but of spirit. The spiritual life of winter also rested heavily on women. They maintained household shrines, lit candles for saints, and led prayers in times of illness or famine. In convents, nuns endured cold cloisters with the same determination as peasants in cottages. Their prayers, chants, and almsgiving were understood as vital to the survival of the broader community. Female saints such as Saint Bridget of Kildare or Saint Catherine of Siena were invoked as protectors, their lives offering models of endurance and faith. Women were seen as mediators between the earthly struggle and divine salvation. Noble women carried different but equally critical burdens. In castles and manors, ladies of the household supervised large staffs, ensuring that supplies were properly stored and distributed. They directed kitchens, oversaw brewing and baking, and managed textiles essential for warmth. When lords were away on campaign, noble women often took full control of estates, negotiating rent, resolving disputes, and organizing relief for tenants during famine. Their authority in these months was not symbolic. It was practical, rooted in the survival of hundreds of people who depended on the estate's resources. Noble women also embodied hospitality. In winter, travelers, pilgrims, and the poor sought shelter in castles and manors. A lady's duty was to provide warmth, food, and charity, acts that reinforce a family's reputation for piety and generosity. Refusal risked dishna. Generosity strengthened bonds of loyalty. Winter transformed noble households into centers of both governance and survival, with women at their core. The dangers they faced were immense. Pregnant women in winter endured higher risks, with poor nutrition and cold increasing complications. Childbirth was perilous year-round, but in lean months, mothers were often too weak to recover. Disease cut through households, and women, as primary caregivers, were frequently the first exposed. Mortality records suggest that women in their childbearing years face some of the highest risks, their work placing them in constant contact with illness and exhaustion. Yet women were also repositories of resilience. Folklore and oral traditions often celebrated their endurance. Tales of wise women who outwitted famine with clever preservation, or who healed the sick with herbs gathered under snow, circulated through villages. These stories reinforce cultural respect for women's roles, even in societies where formal power was denied to them. In the quiet heroism of everyday survival, women exercise a form of authority more enduring than titles or swords. Their labor left lasting marks on material culture. Archaeologists find evidence of women's work in spindle whorls, loom weights, and cooking pots uncovered in medieval sites. Written records, though often authored by men, acknowledge their indispensable role in managing households and estates. Monastic chronicles note the charity of abbesses, the skill of noble women in estate management, and the midwives who braved snow to deliver infants. Though often overlooked in political histories, women were the constant defenders of survival in winter. The rhythm of medieval winter was shaped by their work. Each day began with fire, carried through meals, childcare, and weaving, and ended with prayers by the hearth. Their hands spun wool into clothing, kneaded dough into bread, and nursed children back from illness. When famine struck, it was women who stretched rations, found substitutes, and foraged in forests. When disease spread, it was women who tended the sick and buried the dead. Their role was not ancillary, it was central. In the end, women in winter were the keepers of survival. They bore the heaviest burdens and received the least recognition. Yet without them, communities could not have endured. Their strength was measured not in battles fought, but in fires kept alight, in children carried through hunger, and in communities bound together by their labor. The story of medieval winter is incomplete without them. Women were not only survivors but sustainers, the unacknowledged generals in the war against frost. In the flicker of hearth fires and the resilience of households, their legacy endures, a testament to the quiet, relentless power that kept medieval society alive through its darkest season. In the medieval world, winter was not only a season of hardship, it was a season of myth, where the harsh realities of cold and hunger mingled with stories, folklore, and legends passed down through generations. Around hearths and in monasteries, people sought to explain the power of the frozen world with tales of spirits, saints, and supernatural forces. For peasants and nobles alike, winter became more than climate. It became a realm of imagination, where the unseen governed the visible and where stories gave meaning to suffering. The roots of winter legends lay deep in pre-Christian traditions. Across northern Europe, ancient pagan beliefs envisioned winter as a domain of spirits who brought frost, storms, and hunger. In Norse mythology, giants associated with ice and snow, like Skardi Enimir, represented the primal cold that shaped the cosmos. Even after the spread of Christianity, echoes of these beliefs survived in folklore, with peasants invoking or fearing supernatural beings that stalked the frozen countryside. The persistence of such figures revealed the enduring need to personify the natural forces that dominated life. One of the most enduring legends was that of the wild hunt. On stormy winter nights, people believed they could hear the sound of ghostly riders sweeping across the sky, led by a spectral huntsman. In Germanic tradition, this leader was sometimes wooden. In Christianized versions, it might be a cursed noble or even the devil himself. The wild hunt was said to bring death to those who witnessed it, or to carry away lost souls. It embodied the fear of winter nights, when wind howled through the trees and travelers vanished in snow. To hear the hunt was to be reminded of mortality, a warning that the frozen world belonged to powers beyond human control. Christianity laid new meanings onto older traditions. Saints were invoked as protectors against the dangers of winter. Saint Nicholas, known in the Middle Ages as a bringer of gifts and protector of children, became linked to winter charity and miracles. St. Martin's feast in November marked the beginning of the cold season, and his image as a soldier sharing his cloak with a beggar symbolized mercy in the face of harshness. Candlemas in February used light to symbolize renewal, its processions a defiance of lingering darkness. Through these feasts, the Church reshaped older rituals into Christian narratives, yet the underlying need to explain and master winter endured. Folklore often blended fear with moral lessons. Tales warned against greed during feast times, with stories of those who hoarded food cursed by supernatural retribution. Legends of witches and wise women abounded, many accused of causing storms or sickness in the cold months. In alpine regions, the figure of Perchta emerged, a winter goddess over which you punished lazy spinners and rewarded the diligent. Children were told she would slit open the bellies of the idle and fill them with straw. Such stories reinforced discipline and work ethic during the long indoor months when spinning, weaving, and mending occupied women and children. Animals, too, played roles in winter legends. Wolves, whose howls pierced snowy nights, became symbols of both danger and resilience. Folk tales portrayed them as threats to livestock, but also as cunning survivors of the frozen wild. Birds like ravens or owls were seen as omens, their cries in winter forests interpreted as warnings of death. The natural world, harsh and unforgiving, became a canvas of human imagination, each sound or sight imbued with meaning. Legends also explained famine and disease. In times of hunger, people told stories of frost demons or malevolent beings who stole food from barns. In Scandinavian lore, spirits known as Tomt or Nis were believed to protect households through winter, if treated with respect and given offerings of porridge. If neglected, they might sabotage farms or blight livestock. These stories personalize the unpredictability of survival, offering both comfort and caution. Respect the unseen, and it may spare you. Winter also inspired tales of endurance and heroism. Epic poetry celebrated figures who braved snow and ice to achieve greatness. In Icelandic sagas, heroes journeyed across frozen landscapes, battling both human foes and the elements. These tales reflected the reality that survival itself was an act of courage. They transformed the struggle against winter into narratives of honor, making endurance a form of victory. Folklore spread orally, but it also entered literature. Monastic scribes recorded tales that blended observation with myth. Chronicles described winters of extraordinary severity, sometimes attributing them to divine punishment for sin. In 1815, chroniclers linked the Great Famine to God's wrath, describing storms and cold as instruments of judgment. In such accounts, weather was not random but moral, each snowstorm a sermon written across a land. This worldview gave meaning to suffering, even as it offered little relief. Legends of frozen saints also proliferated. Stories circulated of holy men enduring extreme cold as act of piety, their survival attributed to divine grace. St. Francis of Assisi was said to embrace poverty and cold, walking barefoot through snow. In northern Europe, saints who braved icy landscapes were venerated as models of endurance, embodying the belief that faith could overcome nature's cruelty. Their legends reinforced both hope and obedience, urging communities to see winter not as punishment but as a path to spiritual strength. The psychological role of these legends cannot be overstated. In months when daylight was scarce and hunger constant, stories offered explanations, warnings, and hope. They transformed random misfortune into patterns, linking storms to spirits, famine to demons, and survival to divine favor. For children huddled by the hearth, such tales were both entertainment and education, teaching them to respect the power of the frozen world and the values needed to endure it. Legends also reinforced community identity. Each village had its own tales of haunted forests, cursed fields, or protective spirits. These stories bound people together, offering a shared language of fear and hope. When told during winter gatherings, they reminded listeners that their struggles were not isolated but collective, part of a larger cultural tapestry woven across generations. Even today, echoes of these medieval legends endure. Modern traditions of Santa Claus, Christmas feasts, and winter folklore trace their origins to the stories told in smoky cottages and cloisters centuries ago. The wild hunt, perchta, and the tomb still appear in regional customs and festivals, reminders of how deeply winter shaped imagination. They reveal that for medieval people, the frozen world was not only endured, it was mythologized, turned into a realm where humanity and the supernatural met. The legends of the frozen world remind us that survival in the Middle Ages was not only physical but cultural. People endured winter not just with bread and fire, but with stories that gave meaning to suffering, transformed fear into caution, and celebrated endurance as victory. In the silence of snow-covered nights, these tales kept hope alive, reminding communities that even in darkness, the warmth of imagination could not be extinguished. The medieval winter was more than a season. It was an ordeal that defined the rhythm of life, a recurring test of endurance that shaped culture, faith, and community. For peasants and nobles alike, the long months of frost and hunger were woven into the very fabric of existence. To understand the Middle Ages, one must understand winter, not as a backdrop, but as a central force that governed survival, inspired imagination, and left enduring lessons. Winter in the medieval world meant vulnerability. Agriculture, the foundation of the economy, froze under snow. Hunger stalked villages as a hungry gap deepened. Disease thrived in cold, crowded homes. Armies faltered on frozen roads, and children died in smoky cottages. Yet from these hardships emerged patterns of resilience that carried communities through. Survival was never guaranteed, but neither was it entirely random. It depended on preparation, cooperation, and a shared belief that spring would return. One of the clearest lessons from medieval winter is the importance of community. Families could not endure alone. Villages pooled labor in harvest and preservation, shared ovens and fires, and came together for feast days that lifted spirits during the darkest months. Nobles and clergy provided relief in times of famine, not only from generosity but from necessity. for their power rested on the survival of those below them. Even in times of war, communities found strength in solidarity. Winter revealed that endurance was collective, not individual, a truth that shaped medieval social bonds. Another lesson lies in adaptation. Medieval society developed countless strategies to cope with the cold. Food was salted, smoked, or dried for storage. Houses were clustered together for warmth. Clothing was laid from wool, fur, and linen. Calendars and festivals were aligned with the cycles of feast and famine, ensuring moments of celebration to offset despair. Even military campaigns were adapted to the rhythm of the seasons. Survival depended not on overcoming winter, but on learning to live with it. Faith was central to this endurance. The church framed suffering as part of God's plan, transforming hunger into penance and endurance into virtue. Saints were invoked as protectors against frost and famine. Candlelit rituals reminded people of divine light in darkness. Religious interpretation provided meaning to otherwise random misfortune, helping communities endure the psychological toll of winter. Faith did not change the cold, but it changed how people understood and bore it. The memory of winter shaped identity. Generations grew up with stories of great famines, of harsh frost that killed livestock, of hungry gaps that claimed loved ones. These stories reinforce humility and gratitude in times of abundance. They also fostered caution. Waste was condemned, preparation praised. Winter taught lessons that endured long after the snow melted. It shaped values of moderation, charity, and endurance that echoed through medieval culture. Yet winter was not only suffering, it was also a time of togetherness. Families gathered around hearths, communities celebrated feasts, and stories flourished in the dark months. These moments of warmth and joy were as much a part of winter as hunger and frost. They revealed the dual nature of the season, harsh but also binding, destructive yet also generative. The frozen months forged bonds that might not have been as strong in easier times. The endurance of medieval winter also carried broader consequences. Population growth was checked by cycles of famine and disease, slowing social change. Wars were shaped by seasonal limits, influencing political outcomes. Cultural traditions were reinforced by the rhythm of feast and famine. In this way, winter was not merely a natural phenomenon but a historical force, shaping the trajectory of medieval Europe. Today, the memory of medieval winter lingers in folklore, festivals, and cultural imagination. Traditions of Christmas feasts, midwinter stories, and even modern fears of scarcity echo medieval rhythms. The legends of the Wild Hunt, the reverence of St. Nicholas, and the rituals of Candlemas are cultural descendants of a world that lived at the mercy of frost. These echoes remind us of the endurance of medieval people left legacies beyond survival. It left patterns of meaning that still shape our understanding of winter. The ultimate lesson of the medieval winter is resilience. People faced conditions that tested the limits of endurance. Hunger, disease, and cold claimed lives every year, yet communities endured. They adapted, cooperated, and found meaning in suffering. Their survival was not triumph in the modern sense. It was persistence, a refusal to yield despite endless hardship. That persistence carried Europe through centuries of frozen seasons, leaving behind a history written not only in wars and kings, but in the quiet endurance of ordinary people. Winter remains a force even today, though modern technology has softened its impact. Looking back at the medieval experience reminds us of human fragility and resilience. It shows that survival was never inevitable, that endurance demanded labor, cooperation, and faith. It also shows that hardship could foster solidarity, creativity, and meaning. The medieval winter was unforgiving, but it shaped a culture that learned to endure year after year. As the frozen world receded each spring, medieval communities emerged scarred but strengthened. They carried with them the memory of suffering, the gratitude of survival, and the hope that the next winter might be kinder. Their story is one of endurance, not of conquering nature, but of living with it, surviving alongside it, and finding meaning in its challenges. It is a story that still speaks to us today, reminding us of the resilience woven into human history, born in the shadow of frost and flame.